everybody. Welcome to the Jerusalem Connection Red Alert Report. I am your host, Amy Zawi. Today we have a super special guest, Dr. Gerald McDermott. Dr. Gerald McDermott teaches at the Jerusalem Seminary, the Cranmer Theological House in Dallas, and the Reformed Episcopal Seminary, ACNA, in Philadelphia. He retired from the Anglican Chair of Divinity at Beeson Divinity School in Birmingham, Alabama in 2020. Before that, he was the Jordan Trexler Professor of Religion at Roanoke College, where he taught courses for 26 years in the history of Christianity and Christian theology of world religions. He has written, co-written, or edited over 25 books and hundreds of articles. His most recent book is The History of Redemption, the work of the Jewish Messiah through the millennia. It's a great book. I encourage you all to look for it. I will put links to it in the show notes. Dr. McDermott is a priest with the Reformed Episcopal Church, which is the diocese of the ACNA. He lectures and podcasts frequently, so we're happy to have him. And he and his wife, Jean, have 3 grown children and 14, God bless them, grandchildren. Dr. McDermott, we are so grateful to have you here and share your expertise. The reason why I wanted to have you join our program today is to talk about your most recent article that was published in the Christian Post on July 19th, co-written by Dr. A.J. Nolte and Dr. Jules Gomes. And it is titled The Israel Genocide Delusion of the Church of England. So I found this a very profound article, and it happened as a response to sort of a proclamation or declaration that the Church of England issued. So we'd love you to explain that to us. And also, why is this a topic that should matter for Christians who might be outside the Church of England? And can you explain that, why it matters, as you explain what on earth this Church of England vote was about?
Well, Amy, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. Secondly, this is a matter for all Christians because it's a major Christian church, capital C, a major Christian denomination in the world that is condemning Israel for profoundly unjust reasons. And it concerns us 3 Anglican theologians because we are all part of dioceses that have formerly broken with the Church of England. In fact, as I say in the article, and you remember, that 80% of the provinces, and that means basically a church in each country, 80% of the Anglican provinces worldwide in the global south, in 2023, 3 years ago, formally broke from Canterbury and said, we no longer recognize the authority of the Church of England over us. So, so even though this is a horrendous declaration by the Archbishop of Canterbury and the General Synod of the Church of England that took place on July 13th. There was a vote by the General Synod. So even though we are not formally connected to the Church of England anymore, nevertheless, my 2 colleagues and I felt it was very important to speak out against it because for non-Anglicans, they think of us as represented by this horrendous vote. And we want to say why we're not represented by this horrendous vote and why we radically condemn this horrendous vote. So that's a little bit of the background. Now, what happened in this vote? Let me just briefly explain this. It was July 13th, and the Church of England's General Synod voted in a way that effectively declared Israel to be guilty of genocide and settler colonialism, which denies, we say in this article, Amy, both history and facts on the ground. It was a shameful vote against the Middle East's only democracy, and it ignores the Anglican roots in modern Zionism. And I can get to that here in the interview. So what this vote did was it said, we hear, a technical term for saying that we basically agree with most of a particular manifesto, even though we might not agree with all the details. We hear the Kairos 2 manifesto. That's a Christian Palestinian document that has been circulated worldwide in the last few months. And it's called A Moment of Truth, Faith in a Time of Genocide. And this manifesto alleges that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, that Israel's war on Hamas is not self-defense, that Palestinians are the indigenous, and that's the word they use, people in the land, and the Jews are the settler colonialists, and that Christian Zionism has produced both apartheid and ethnic cleansing. So in the article, we felt it was very important to show how all of these claims are totally false. And secondly, as I just said, that this vote has already been, in effect, nullified by 80% of the world's Anglicans.
So I think that's so important for our viewers to understand. Just this week, somebody was asking me, somebody who's outside Christendom in general, a Jewish friend of mine, well, what is the Church of England? What are Anglicans? And I was trying to explain that how there's sort of this original idea that I explained the origins of the Church of England, but it is very important that folks, we will link the article. You all can read it yourselves because you need to see the outline of these accusations and the very concrete reasons why they're incorrect that are refuted by the authors. But also, it's important for everybody to know that when they drive by an Anglican church in XYZ city, America or Canada or someplace else, that you don't have a knee-jerk reaction because you read about what the Church of England did, and now all the priests or parishioners in that church are in agreement. So it's really important that, and we're thankful that you wrote this rebuttal, so to speak, this refutation of the false assertions that were made, but also reminding the public that not everybody that has the Anglican name is in lockstep. And even those under the Church of England didn't necessarily agree with the whole vote. So that's really important. And like I said, I encourage everybody to read the article directly because it is just full of vital facts about what is going on and how these accusations of genocide and colonialism and that the Jewish people are not indigenous, they are just refuted very systematically. So as Christians, they read the Christian Post, they read the mainstream news or the legacy media. What is it that we can do that can sort of inoculate ourselves or prepare ourselves to be able to not be misled by emotionally charged or emotionally motivated narratives that might come from a pulpit, and the pulpit that might have a big C, so it does have a powerful and wide-reaching voice?
Well, for Christians to inoculate themselves and to properly discern things concerning Israel and Christian theology generally, I would say read the Bible. Mm-hmm. Most Christians do not read the Bible. Most evangelicals, although the movement historically has prided itself on being Bible focused and reading the Bible, most evangelicals do not read the Bible. So I would say read the Bible in a systematic way. Now, if you're an Anglican, we have something called the Daily Office, where each prayer book leads us through most of the Bible each year. And we have these beautiful prayers going back to the early church called liturgy that are far richer, I would say, and far more historic than simply something we can think off the top of our head. So I'd say that's the first thing, is get back into Scripture. And particularly if you've never really read the Bible in a systematic way, in a regular way, or if you simply read those parts, your favorite parts of the book, and you read them over and over, you're probably ignoring some massive parts of the biblical message. Secondly, read real news on Israel. Now, I would recommend the 3 opinion pages each day, Monday through Saturday, in the Wall Street Journal. Not the news sections so much, because they tilt left, but the opinion pages tilt right. And by right, I mean more in accord with historic, moral, and religious views, and particularly Jewish Christian. Or the news in the Jerusalem Post, or the news in the Times of Israel. If you really want to get the straight scoop on what is going on over there, I would point you to those 3 newspapers.
And if you wouldn't mind, most of our audience, like you said, has their favorite parts of their Bible. They read them. Many have dug and dove headfirst into the Tanakh with Shelley when she started Bible Fiber, that has now gone through all the minor prophets and now is doing the weekly Torah portions. And these are beautiful ways to engage in the text. And Shelley does a great job of explaining what it's actually saying, not over metaphorizing it, if that's a word. But can you give us sort of the elevator version, or the cliff notes of what are those biblical foundations that seem to get lost with replacement theology and seem to get lost when people aren't reading, especially their Hebrew Bible? Maybe they're concentrating on the New Testament or the Christian Testament. You know, sometimes Christians get involved in conversations, or they overhear things, or they hear things on the news, and they kind of get a little bit lost. Like, they know in their heart that, okay, that's Israel, that's the land, that's the people, but they can't articulate. Like, unfortunately, Ted Cruz kind of got caught off guard in an interview because he didn't have the meat on the bones of the biblical text, not a story about the Bible that we're retelling, but the biblical text. Just walk us through those major points that we can rely on and say these are steadfast.
Well, Amy, I think the first thing I would say is that replacement theology means that, so let's define what we're talking about here. Replacement theology means that God has replaced the Jews as his chosen people, the Gentile church as his new chosen people. And God has replaced the land of Israel as the center of the kingdom of God, and Jerusalem as the place where he said he would eternally place his name. Now, name in the Bible doesn't mean what we think of in English as name, simply a moniker that our parents gave us, or the name of a city or a country. No, name, God's name, means where and when he makes his presence most thickly visible and effective. So we Anglicans say in the sacraments, we especially find God's presence most thickly available and effective. And when God said he puts his name in Jerusalem, and it will eternally be in Jerusalem, it means his thickly available and present being will be in Jerusalem like it's nowhere else in the world. And Jerusalem, in most places in the Bible, stands for all the land of Israel. So replacement theology says God replaced the land of Israel and Jerusalem as the thickest presence of his person with all the lands of the world and all the cities of the world. Now, that's also called supersessionism. It comes from the word supersede, which means to go beyond and replace. So it has to do, as I was just suggesting, with 2 things: the people and the land. The Jewish people have been replaced by the Gentile church as the chosen people, and the land of Israel has been replaced by all the lands of the world. Now, most Christians have held this since the 4th century, since Constantine, when he institutionalized both these phenomena. But it's not taught by the Bible. Now, most Christians who know in their gut that replacement theology is wrong, all they've been taught is how to turn to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, as a place to go in the Bible to refute that. And that's all well and good because the Hebrew Bible is God's word. And it's throughout the Hebrew Bible that the Jews are the chosen people, and the land of Israel, although God is present in all the world, he's more present in the land of Israel. And although he's present in a special way in all the land of Israel, he's more present, even more thickly present in the city of Jerusalem. And although he's especially present so there are degrees of presence. He's even more present at the temple, and really, really present at the temple, but even more so in the holy place, and really, really present in the holy place, but even more so in the Holy of Holies, and so forth. So we all know that, Christians who are familiar with what they call the Old Testament know that's all over the Old Testament. But there's a movement that I'm a leader of called the New Christian Zionism, and we published a book with that title 10 years ago now in 2016, the New Christian Zionism. Thank you, Amy. that proves, and this is a scholarly book, but it's not just for scholars. We wrote it to be accessible to non-scholars. In this book, we show how the idea that the Jews are still God's chosen people and the land of Israel is still a holy land is all throughout the New Testament, from Matthew to Revelation. So now this is a very long-winded way of trying to answer your question. Where should Christians go to? Where do we especially see this? And I'll sum that whole book that you just held up, which I think is more than 400 pages.
Just about, with the appendix and index.
Yeah. But it is accessible. I want to tell your viewers it is accessible.
I read it. It's accessible
to non. So I'll sum it up by saying, you see this, that the Jews are still the chosen people, and the land is still the Holy Land in the New Testament, and I'll sum it up with Jesus and Paul, and I think those are two pretty important persons in the New Testament.
Yeah.
So Jesus, for example, in Matthew 5:18, I'll quote it. He declares that God inscribed even the smallest stroke of the pen in every part of the Old Testament. He says that in Matthew 5:18. Every jot and tittle, and the Greek there is for jot, it's iota, which means the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, and tittle, the Greek word there is choria, which means horn, which means the smallest stroke of the pen in Hebrew. Wow. And he says that God inscribed every part of it. Now, the Old Testament, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, Jesus is saying everything there is from God. And I show in the New Christian Zionism, which you just held up, that the land promise is repeated explicitly there 500 times and implicitly 500 other times, for a total of 1,000 times. And throughout the Old Testament, I think anyone who's had any exposure to the Old Testament knows the Jews, that God chose the Jews to be his chosen people. It's all throughout the Old Testament. So Jesus is affirming both of those.
Mm-hmm.
when he says that every stroke of the pen in Matthew 5:18 is inscribed by God, is put there by God. Now, how about Paul? Paul preached a sermon in Antioch of Pisidia. That's a city in modern day Turkey that I've been to, and maybe you've been there, Amy.
I have not.
And he preached a sermon there more than 25 years after he met Jesus on the road to Damascus. So this is not just a leftover from his pre-road to Damascus days. No, he's still saying this and preaching it 25 years later. In fact, just a few years before Nero cuts his head off. And Paul says in this sermon, it's Acts 13, starting at verse 17, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers, and after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Now, that's basically the book of Joshua there, which most Christians and most Jews have a hard time defending. It's probably the hardest book of the Bible to defend today in this 21st century. The conquest narratives in the book of Joshua. Paul is not embarrassed. Paul is not ashamed of the book of Joshua at all. He says, after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, God gave them, and the them there is the people of Israel, the land. In the Greek it says their land, and the there refers to the 7 nations of the Canaanites. God gave to the people of Israel the Canaanites' land as an inheritance. Paul could not have preached the land promise more explicitly. So that's about the most concise I can be, Amy, to for your viewers, to tell them that the New Testament, it's not just the Old Testament, it's the New Testament that also teaches that the Jewish people are still the chosen people. In Romans 11:28 and 29, it's most explicit for Paul, where Paul is specifically talking about his fellow Jews who have not accepted Jesus as Messiah. And he says they're still beloved. That's the word he uses in verse 28. They're still beloved of God. God has not given up on them. And then in the very next verse, he says, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. That is, not revoked, not taken away, not canceled like in our cancel culture. Now, the gifts and calling, what does he mean by gifts and calling? Well, the number one gift that his contemporary, Philo of Alexandria, Jewish philosopher, Josephus, the great Jewish historian, and Ezekiel, the tragedian, that's about the Jewish people. And foremost for each one of them, and for Paul, is the land. And then he says the calling. Now, klesis is the Greek word there. And calling, that was a technical term in Greek, in Jewish Greek, for God's calling of the Jews to be his chosen people. Paul is saying here that calling of God to be the chosen people is not revoked, will never be revoked, has not been revoked. And he's saying this 25 years down the road, just a few years before he dies, that the Jews are still the chosen people. So, Amy, this is the New Testament. We Christian Zionists don't have to appeal just to the Old Testament. We can appeal to the New Testament.
That's right. And I think that's an important point to make, because if we're engaged in a dialogue, a discussion, a friendly and loving debate with a Christian brother or sister who is hanging their hat on this supersessionism, and they're already taking the Hebrew Testament and using the term old and saying, oh, this is the new covenant, as if new replaces old rather than building on. And just saying, okay,
Right.
well, he said it, but it's allegory, right? There's a lot of turning it in, twisting it into a fable, a moral, a representation, a symbolic thing. So by using the New Testament, the Christian Testament, Paul's writings, and Jesus's words, of course, it really helps get that misled brother or sister to perhaps see that this dismissal of the Old Testament can be revealed in the new. And I'm really glad you brought that up. And both the new Christian Zionism and your latest book from 2024, which, sorry, this is just amazing too, because it really tells the story, kind of the story of it, how Israel is just an integral part of the whole story of from creation till the end of days. And I encourage people to get that too. We'll put all these books are on Amazon. I encourage folks to go find them. And we also are going to put the link to the Christian Post article that we're referencing, and we're going to get back to it. But I really wanted to thank you, Dr. McDermott, for giving us these foundational points that we can take with us right now today as we go out and have conversations this weekend with folks at church or maybe at work or what have you. So what should we do then as Christians? So we're armed with historical and biblical truth, and we have that in our heart and our mind, and then we're confronted with Israel being falsely accused or truth being distorted, and we get that from neighbors or colleagues or social media posts. Not that we want to answer every one of those, but how do we respond, or what would you suggest for us to do when we take our facts and deliver them? What's your suggestion?
Speak up. Speak up. Don't just let these distortions, these lies being repeated by family members and friends and neighbors, go unchallenged. You know, those of us who know history, who learned in high school or college or in our own reading about the 1930s, and the churches, the Christians in the 1930s who knew that Jews were starting to be persecuted, who knew that Hitler was preaching that the Jews are the number one problem, are the curse on the earth. And then particularly in the mid-30s, when Jews started to disappear, in the late 30s, and then of course news of Jews in Germany started to leak out. We look back first on the German Christians and then the other European Christians who started to know about these things in the 30s and of course the early 40s, and they were silent and they did nothing, and they spoke up and they did not speak up. And we say, how could they have been silent? Well, you know what? It's the 1930s again. Jews are being killed all over the world, are being murdered all over the world. Just 2 in New York City yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Yesterday,
stabbed, right?
For the crime of being Jewish. For the crime of being Jewish. Well, now it's our time to speak up. Mm-hmm. We should not criticize the German Christians for being silent if we are silent too.
That's right. That's right. And that sometimes means getting into a difficult conversation. I know that sometimes when a pastor kind of is preaching something and I've been in churches where pastors have implicated Jews or implicated the Israelites in such a way that is so unflattering, like they lost it, they just repackaging the replacement theology in a subtle way. And I've had to email them and say, this is just, it not only is that wrong, but you're also sending the message to the congregants that hating these people is okay because you just said that God was mad at them or God rejected them, right, and what have you. Right. And it seeps in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's just off the cuff comments from people. And I've had to stop people at dinner parties and I try to be kind and I try to ask, well, what makes you say that? Or why, just, and especially depending on what the comment is or the trope, I try to get them to unravel where they got it from. And then I'll explain maybe, why a lot of Jews in Europe got into banking because they couldn't own land and they were forbidden from being farmers and whatnot. So you kind of give them a little history lesson, but I try to do it in a loving way when as an educational moment. It can be difficult, and sometimes it's hard to speak up. It's hard, but we have to do it because sometimes just giving one person a little light bulb of being self-aware, then that trickles out into whatever communities they deal in at work or what have you. Um, so I want to talk about when we're encouraging everybody for standing for truth and loving Israel and remaining biblically grounded. Um, I know you have an upcoming conference in Dallas. I want you to tell us a little bit about that because it's the first of its kind. And maybe you can just give us a little quick lesson. We do have Anglicans in our audience, but it's certainly just a portion, and a lot of evangelicals aren't necessarily familiar with the liturgical practices and the traditions. If you can just kind of tell us about this conference and then just tell us how, you mentioned it before a little bit, but how that maybe we could all turn to some of the practices and prayers, as you mentioned, that can really help reinforce us and give us, I hate to use the word ammunition, but maybe fuel for going forward in our quest to stand with Israel and the Jewish people.
Well, fuel for our souls. We all need to strengthen our souls in this dark time. And the times, I think, to be realistic, are going to get darker. So we need fuel for our souls. So this conference, and thank you for asking about it. It's a one-day conference on Wednesday, October 21st, in a suburb of Dallas, and it's called Jesus the Jew: Does this affect the gospel? ? And it's the first ever, as far as I know, conference by Anglicans dedicated to the subject of the Jewishness of Jesus and the significance of that Jewishness. How does it affect the gospel? Does it affect the gospel? Of course, my answer is yes. It affects the gospel in profound ways. And, you know, there are all different kinds of Anglicans, just as there are all different kinds of Pentecostals and Baptists and Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Lutherans and Methodists and non-denoms and evangelicals. Those of us who are sponsoring this conference are traditional Anglicans, which means we believe that Anglicanism is not 500 years old, but 2,000 years old. It was started in the first century, and it became the small c Catholic Church in England, which had its own character, and it's always had its own character. And so we are a part of this branch of Anglicanism that believes our roots go back 2,000, not 500 years. And we've always believed in the Bible and tradition. Now, what most Christians and even most Protestants have realized is that none of us read the Bible without interpreting it through a tradition. It might be through our charismatic tradition. It might be through our evangelical tradition. And evangelicals do indeed have their own traditions. It might be through their Pentecostal tradition. Everyone reads the Bible and interprets it differently depending on the tradition that they've been raised in, or that they've been schooled in, or that they've recently become a part of and are trying to get their minds around. So now Anglicans particularly have said, historic, traditional Anglicans, as I've described them, have said that we should read the Bible at the feet of the fathers. That means the fathers of the church, especially in the first millennium of the church, when the church was not divided at all. Now, they had different parts of the church that did things a little bit differently, but everyone for the first millennium, the first 1,000 years before the Great Schism in 1054, had basically the same liturgy, which means the same worship on Sunday morning, and the same sacraments. They all had sacraments, and they generally had them every Sunday, not just once a month. And their beliefs about the sacraments were generally the same. So we historic traditional Anglicans say that we should read the Bible at the feet of the fathers. Let the fathers teach us how to interpret the Bible. Now, the fathers were divided on this question of Israel, and there were many fathers who got it right. There were fathers who got it wrong, but there were fathers who got it right too. So they were divided, just like every other tradition, I would say, in the church, from east to west and north to south. There are those who get it right, and those who don't get it right. So we traditional Anglicans particularly say that, as Luther and Calvin themselves taught, that whereas there are different senses in Scripture, in interpreting Scripture, there are spiritual senses, and there's also the plain sense, what's called the literal sense, which is not the same thing as literalistic. That we should prefer first, before we go to the allegorical spiritual senses, we should go first to the plain sense, the literal sense, what is also called the historical sense. What did it mean then? Mm-hmm. And what is the plain text? And so we believe that, and this, by the way, is the way that most of the fathers in the first millennium of the undivided church, the way they interpret the Bible, that we go to the plain sense first. And so, starting in the 16th century, many Anglicans looked at the way Luther and Calvin had interpreted the text, and they both were classic supersessionists, classic replacement theologians. And they said, Luther and Calvin taught us in the Reformation that we should prefer the plain sense, but they're not doing it when it comes to Israel. They are allegorizing everything of the Old Testament and saying that everything that refers to the Jews automatically refers to the Gentile church. And we don't think that's right. They aren't being consistent in applying their own Reformation hermeneutic, which means how do you interpret, to the Old Testament. When it comes to all these promises about the future of the Jews and the future of the land. And so it was the Anglicans who picked up the Puritan principle, and the Puritans were good on this in the 16th century, and they too said that, look, even though we're Calvinists, we disagree with the way Calvin is interpreting all these prophecies in the Old Testament about the future of the Jewish people and the future of the land of Israel. He's not using the plain sense. He's being far too spiritual and far too allegorical. So, so it was the Anglicans primarily in the 18th and 19th century in England who were teaching Christian Zionism, and it's because of the champions then in the 19th century, like Lord Shaftesbury, who was the greatest Christian Zionist in the Church of England in the 19th century, who had great influence on Parliament. As I say here in the article, he was an advocate, huge advocate in the 19th century for a Jewish homeland. And it was his advocacy that laid the foundation for the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which was a publicized letter from the British Foreign Secretary declaring that Britain would seek, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, close quote. And it was this letter that was largely influenced by Shaftesbury, that contributed significantly to the League of Nations giving to Britain in 1922 control over the regions that are now Jordan and Israel. And this in turn helped stimulate the United Nations partition plan for Palestine in 1947 and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Now Shaftesbury, as an Anglican, was ashamed of England's history as the first Western nation to ban Jews from its soil in 1290. Mm-hmm. And he was hoping, along with most of his fellow Anglicans back in the 19th century, that England would be the first Gentile nation to stop the pattern of treading down Jerusalem. Now, that's a quote of Jesus's in Luke 21, which means Gentile military and political control of Jerusalem. Shaftesbury noticed that ever since his country of England started sheltering Jews under Cromwell and Charles II, that England had prospered. And the same was true for tiny Holland. But Spain, which had once been a superpower, started to decline immediately after it expelled the Jews in 1492. And Shaftesbury wrote in his journal about the import of the biblical promise in Genesis 12:3, that God would bless those who bless Israel, and he would curse those who dishonored her. So that's a little bit about the Anglican roots in modern Zionism, leading to modern Zionism, that this vote on July 13th totally ignored, therefore was false to history and to its own roots as a Church of England.
Yeah, it's really tragic. It's really tragic to hear and see this great institution that was such a powerhouse of promise in following God's word in its plain text. As you said, I'm curious, this is probably another conversation, but I want to know wondering what's going on in the hearts and minds of that current clergy that's at the Church of England in Canterbury, but we won't speculate on that today. We'll just keep praying for them. But I thank you for coming on. I thank you for penning this article. We are going to share it with everybody. There's so much important information in it. And it's important that the larger Christian community understand what's going on and why the lies, the errant clergy that are out there with high podiums that they can speak from, and also the reality of the roots of the Anglican Church. We certainly want the Anglican community that is on the right side of this to not in any way be shunned by the other communities because they're misinterpreting what's the Church of England and the traditional Anglican that you're a part of and others. Thank you so much, Dr. McDermott. We are excited to have you on again in the future. Your insights and wisdom are so important and so treasured by us. We're really blessed that you could share your scholarship and your spiritual insights with all of us.
Well, thank you, Amy, so much for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Shavua Tov.
And same to you.
If you enjoy these conversations, please visit us at www.thejerusalemconnection.us. Find all our podcasts on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast program. Follow us on social media, subscribe, like, and share our content to reach the broadest audience.